you see with the Ukrainians, they're using hundreds of one-way attack UAVs of a myriad of different types for their campaign against Russian oil and gas and military targets as well. But it's not strategically decisive. And a lot of the most significant hits still tend to be Storm Shadow, occasionally Flamingo, their own cruise missile that they developed.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today on day, I think it's 1,340 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to an old friend of Frontline, Justin Bronk. Now Justin is a senior research fellow for air power and technology in the military systems team at RUSI, and editor of the RUSI Defense Systems online journal, I believe. And your particular areas of interest and expertise include modern combat air environment, which I think we'll touch on, Russian and Chinese ground-based air defenses and fast jet capabilities, and the air war during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I do want to get into. And tied into that, unmanned combat aerial vehicles and novel weapons of technology. And you've written exclusively for RUSI and a variety of other publications and broadcast in a number of other different outlets. Justin, welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
So, once again, we are seeing reports of Russian incursion into NATO airspace, albeit, a tanker and a fighter for a matter of seconds. But given we have had drones and MiG-31s and one-way attack drones over the past weeks, what should NATO do?
I mean, the simple answer is there needs to be a reassertion of the red lines. And we have seen this in the past where, for example, Turkey shot down a Russian Su-24 Fencer after, it must be said, repeated airspace violations over a small section of Turkish airspace that sort of, because of the shape of the border, juts south into what is mostly Syrian airspace. That was quite a long time ago now. But the actual response from the Russians after that, there was a lot of kind of political teeth-sucking from the collective NATO community. And the actual Russian response was to put an S-400 air defense system in Khmeimim, in their airbase in Syria, to be able to threaten aircraft in Turkish airspace. But within a few months, they were in negotiations to sell the Turks the same S-400 system, indeed successfully. And what actually happened is, in practical terms, is that the airspace violation stopped and didn't happen again. Equally, where you saw US Special Operations Command essentially thwack with a lot of air power airstrikes around 300 Russian Wagner Mercs when they crossed the Euphrates deconfliction line in Syria. They were warned. Deconfliction line was used with the Russian commander in Syria. They denied they were Russians, even though they knew the Americans knew they were Russians, etc. And again, the response was actually very muted from Moscow after nearly 300 Russians were killed and injured by American airstrikes. And the practical response was that they didn't cross the deconfliction line again. So if you look at the way that Russia tends to respond, the answer is relatively simple. They will push until they hit resistance. The flip side to that is that, firstly, the rules under which NATO conducts air policing, so the combat air patrols with fighter aircraft on the eastern flank, are still essentially the same as they have been for many decades. And so, I mean, the name is air policing, it's not air defense. So one of the things that needs to be changed pretty urgently, and NATO Air Command has been trying to get this changed for a number of years now, is to change the rules of engagement and change the terminology to NATO air defense, which would enable more robust rules of engagement for how you deal with aircraft that violate. One of the core problems, though, is that essentially the fear, which it's not just a fear of Russian retaliation per se. The fear among a lot of NATO nations and commanders is that if a NATO combat air patrol or a national air patrol from, let's say, Poland or another member state in the Baltics were to shoot down Russian aircraft, that the response from some of the other NATO members, particularly in the south and the west, who don't see the threat in the same way, that response would be so divergent that it would cause more damage to NATO's unity and credibility as a result than not shooting down the violating Russian aircraft in the first place. So that's essentially the concern. But yeah, I think fundamentally, violating NATO airspace with crewed aircraft, so fighters, tankers, is one of the few things where NATO does have an immediate set of response capabilities, which are well suited to the task, sustainable, and therefore is quite a contrast to some of the sabotage operations and the violations with UAVs, where really there aren't immediately easy tools or responses. So it's one of the easiest things for NATO to respond to, and I think the Polish response was one of the better ones to the initial violation of the three MiG-31s, which was in Estonian airspace, which was, I believe I quote, if you violate again and we shoot your aircraft down, don't come crying to us, to address the Russian delegation at the UN. So, yeah, hopefully a harder line is taken, because the problem is if it isn't, you'll just see more and more and more violations, eroding the ability to defend NATO borders and probably increasing the chances of a wider conflict.
And talking those more and more violations, and working in an area that is complex because it is in between national security and probably outside NATO's remit to deal with. We've had all of these drone incursions, not the Shahad drones into Poland, but we've had drones over German critical national infrastructure, over Danish airfields, over Swedish military infrastructure. Do you think that is a deliberate act by the Russians, testing using the grey zone, knowing it's an area that sort of falls between the cracks of who's responsible for dealing with it? What do you think countries should be doing about that?
Well, I'm sure some of it is. The difficulty, of course, and one of the things that makes this sort of harassment very effective, from the Russians' point of view, is that once they start doing probing around air bases and airports and things, first of all, you might well get civilian copycats deliberately, people just looking to cause some trouble and because it's funny, or as far as they're concerned. But then you also get attribution of people assume that because there have been some things that are probably Russian, then every civilian drone they see that's in the wrong place, or that they imagine they see that isn't actually there, that's just them misinterpreting landing lights, for example, from a plane. So you get a kind of snowballing effect where more and more is attributed than potentially is even there. But certainly some of it is indeed Russian probing. And there's a few difficulties. I mean, first and foremost, you can never defend everything. It's just impossible to cover everything. Not least because the West as a whole has been way too slow in investing in counter UAV capabilities at scale. I mean, this has been clear as a potential threat since at least the mid 2010s, when Daesh, for example, was using FPV drones and armed ones at scale in Iraq, for example, and Syria. But a lot of what we do produce goes to Ukraine, who need it more. And so there's also that kind of split in productive capacity versus the sort of production volumes that are out there. And a lot of systems that we would potentially feel somewhat comfortable putting, for example, around commercial airports, they tend to be what we call non-kinetic. So using directed energy, so jamming signals, for example, to try and disable those sort of UAVs. If they're not using commercial frequencies, or if they are using, for example, a fiber optic cable or whatever, there are types of UAVs that won't necessarily be susceptible to those things. And the instinctive thing, I think, from a lot of people of, well, why don't you just shoot at them? It can be done, and that might be part of the answer, particularly at military installations. We've seen the UK looking at increasing powers to shoot down UAVs, unidentified UAVs, over military bases in the past week. And I think that's positive. But ultimately, anytime you're giving people live ammunition and telling them that they can blat off into the sky at a UAV that they see, you can imagine, particularly around commercial airports, that that's an absolute nightmare from a safety point of view, in a whole host of ways. The same for flying things like drone interceptors. So there isn't a particularly easy answer. And fundamentally, there's also a jurisdiction problem. So, for example, at military bases, in the UK, we would have primary responsibility for defence of, let's say, RAF bases would be with the RAF regiment. and to a degree as well the military police, or the RAF police. But of course, their jurisdiction ends pretty much at the perimeter. And so if somebody is flying UAVs from a van, you might have equipment to be able to geolocate where that is, using the command signal, if you can detect it, which often you can. But of course, they don't have the jurisdiction to go and try and arrest somebody 4 or 5 kilometers away. That would be the local constabulary. And so probably part of the answer needs to be better coordination between the intelligence services, who would be primarily responsible for tracking who these networks are, particularly Russian-backed and influenced or Russian-controlled, who are bringing in, for example, let's say explosives, because while you can buy UAVs commercially, you can't buy explosives easily, who are trying to assemble them or move them around and wrecking bases. There's activity which you would expect the intelligence services to be fundamentally tracking and trying to deal with and intercepting, if need be, before it becomes a problem. And then equally, enforcement would be mostly local police until it crosses a boundary, and then it becomes force protection for the military. So it's cross-government as a task, and fundamentally one of the things that makes it really hard is that cross-government, cross-agency, cross-force is often really, really, really complicated to make work on a day-to-day basis, especially because all law enforcement and the military force protection teams as well are understaffed, and there just aren't enough of them to cover all the potential threats.
Oh, tell me about the complexity of doing that. But with what we're seeing, in this grey zone activity, and then expand that into what we're seeing with the use of drones at the tactical level in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and then with what we're seeing with the use of drones at a more operational level, or we're now getting into them having a strategic impact. Are we seeing what we considered our definition of air power and air operations expanding, and we have to look at this? Are we seeing it changing? Are we seeing fundamental differences? Is this just an adaptation that seems to happen in every conflict as things adjust? And do you think we're learning the lessons from it?
Well, there's certainly a lot of effort to learn lessons. The difficulty, of course, being that everybody tends to pick out the lessons that they want and try and ignore the ones that are a bit inconvenient for whatever their particular role or kind of bailiwick is. But essentially, I think the core definition of air power in terms of how we apply air power in the West hasn't really changed. But what we're seeing is a huge amount of, quite rightly, emphasis on a conflict that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's been going on for years, where neither side can employ air power the way that we do. And so you're seeing a very, very different kind of conflict, including in the air dimension, play out. In terms of the continued relevance of the kind of traditional air power that we rely on very heavily for our military model, one only has to look at the Israelis' operation against the Israeli operation Rising Lion against Iranian targets for a bunch of this year, for 12 days in particular, where, I mean, this is a country, in case of Israel, that it has a hugely long history of using UAVs militarily. They were, in many ways, the pioneers of using lots of, or relatively large numbers of relatively small UAVs at every level of their military. They are very good at using them from a special forces point of view inside Iran, and that was part of that operation. And of course, the Iranians themselves have exactly the sort of military which a lot of the kind of technological evangelists would have us build, i.e. many, many hundreds of thousands of drones in small scale, tens of thousands of one-way attack drones, so cheap precision mass, and lots of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And of course, that was a very one-sided exchange where the Israeli traditional air power was completely dominant because they were able to sequence the full kind of gamut of capabilities with tankers, fighters, special forces, electronic warfare, and they also crucially have invested in what we call kinetic effectors, i.e. weapons, which can actually be used effectively to strike ground-based air defences, the S-300 systems in particular, which is one of the key gaps in Europe. We have the right aeroplanes, we have the right tactics, what we don't have are the weapons. Because we focused weapons procurement on the sort of weapons we need for counterinsurgency and making those affordable, so laser and GPS-guided bombs, basically. And those aren't the weapons that you need, really, for going after an air defense network. What you see with the large scale use of one-way attack UAVs, so the Garan 2 and 3, which are the Russian built version of Shahed 136s, as well as a lot of, at the moment, Gabera, which is a decoy and electronic reconnaissance UAV, which is about a third of the cost of a Garan, so they can use them in large numbers. And that's what violated Polish airspace in numbers quite recently. The Russians are getting more and more sophisticated with the way they use them. And you're looking at anywhere between about 400 and 500 a night. But what's interesting is, while that is a core part of the challenge for the Ukrainian air defense network, it poses huge problems for saturating air defense coverage, capacity of operators to sift through all of the incoming tracks. The Russians are getting better at using them in waves for reconnaissance to try and work out where Ukrainian air defenses are and then potentially divert attack drones towards them as part of the follow-on wave, that kind of stuff. Even despite that, it's still fundamentally the cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that are doing most of the really serious damage. It's just that the UAVs are making it much, much harder to intercept those ballistic and cruise missiles sustainably. And so, in the same way you see with the Ukrainians, they're using hundreds of one-way attack UAVs of a myriad of different types for their campaign against Russian oil and gas and military targets as well. But it's not strategically decisive. And a lot of the most significant hits still tend to be Storm Shadow, occasionally Flamingo, their own cruise missile that they developed, although that has some accuracy issues. But basically, if you're looking at how we apply these sort of things to the Western approach to it, essentially deterring Russia, which is what matters in Europe for us, I think, there is a need, first of all, for massive investment in counter-UAS capabilities, so counter-drone capabilities, both at the front line and around key installations like air bases and ports. Because the Russians will use lots of one-way attack UAVs, and internally the GRU and others will use small UAVs against us. So that defensive thing is required. But fundamentally, on the offensive side, I think the key is to, like the Israelis, invest in one-way attack systems and/or things that can be used by special forces in small numbers as a means of enabling our relatively small number of appropriate high-end munitions to actually get through to those key air defense targets, because it is still overwhelmingly more efficient as a means of destroying something like a Russian ground force presence on NATO territory, which will have a lot of tanks and artillery and things. It's still overwhelmingly more efficient to do that with JDAM, paveway, i.e. traditional laser and GPS guided bombs dropped from fighters, which cost somewhere in the region of about £30,000 a bomb, so about less than half the cost of a Shahed, and can destroy any known tank, any known fighting position, in one go, and you can carry 4 of them per aircraft at least, and you can repeat it on a regular basis, and they're quite easy to produce. I guess what I'm getting at is that there's a reason why we've built everything around this air power instrument, and we saw from the Israelis against the Iranians quite how effective that is when you can enable it to get through.
Well, it's interesting, and on paper, the Russians had that sort of capability before they carried out their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's quite clear from the latest parades that we've seen in Beijing that China seems to be learning as many lessons from it as possible, with the sheer variety of different ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and UAVs and everything else on display with their new aircraft. But why did the Russian Air Force, the VKS, why do they not have such a big impact on the initial stages of the conflict in Ukraine, and why have they not had an impact since? Because on paper, they should have completely and utterly decimated anything that Ukraine had, and therefore made it easy for the ground forces.
Well, fundamentally, first, there were 2 factors which meant that the Russians weren't able to establish air superiority early on in the conflict. The first one was that they were up against one of the densest and most capable air defense networks in Europe. Well, if you don't count Russia as part of Europe, it was the densest and most capable air defense network in Europe. The Ukrainian air defense network at the start of the war, fully indigenous, was extremely impressive. A lot of S-300s, multiple different types, PS, PT, and then also the V models. A lot of books, so SA-11, a lot of SA-8, OSA, thousands of manpads. So this was not a pushover from an air point of view. And I think there wasn't enough appreciation of quite how capable that was among analysts in the West and in Russia, clearly, thank goodness. But the second one is that the way that the West employs air power against, and particularly the US, employs air power to deconstruct something like that, so a ground-based air defense network, which has aircraft as well as part of the threat, so some fighters, but is primarily a ground-based threat, is something called a CAMEO, which is the composite air operation, or a complex air operation. And essentially what that is layering together multiple different formations of multiple different types of jet and other enablers like cruise missiles and decoys and electronic warfare effects, and essentially creating pulses, usually 2 to 3 a day, of potentially a couple of hundred aircraft at once, plus all of these enablers, to essentially have all of the different component parts, suppression of air defenses assets, offensive counter-air assets, electronic warfare assets, strike assets. All of these things kind of are greater than the sum of their parts when you put them together. But putting those together requires extremely complex planning, a very, very complex execution for each pilot, each crew involved. And it's something that we pretty intensively structure the kind of, if you like, the fighter pilot training and kind of professional development pipeline around, and have done for many, many decades. The Russians just don't fly like that. They've never flown like that. And so, most of their flying pre-war was, singleton or pairs doing simple navigation sorties and occasionally dropping a bomb or firing a weapon according to pre-planned ground-based commands. And therefore, when they tried to put things together, they could fly lots of aircraft, or relatively large numbers of aircraft, in the same place at roughly the same time. But they weren't mutually supporting in a dynamic way. And so they weren't able to sequence everything together. And so it was pretty easy for that to start to go wrong. And every time it did, they'd lose airplanes in it. They've kind of struggled to break out of that fairly rigid and ground-based approach to sequencing air power. What's changed in the past 18 months, though, is that you've started seeing particularly in the last 18 months, the Russian Air Force, the VKS, actually having a really significant impact on the front lines. In fact, in some ways, they are the most significant impact on Ukraine's ability to hold or not parts of the front, and that's through the use of glide bombs at a very large scale. So what they've done is put into mass production and regular upgrades as well, something called the UPMK, which is it's an acronym in Russian, but it says essentially a wing kit with GPS, or GLONASS, which is the Russian equivalent of GPS guidance capability. And it's pretty cheap. It looks pretty nasty, partly because initially they were kind of knocked up in somebody's shed. But they've iterated them consistently, partly because they're pretty cheap and cheerful. And so these days you're looking at them having 8 to 12 GPS antennas, so they are, or GLONASS antennas, so they're very resistant to electronic jamming. They're reasonably accurate. You're talking to within 10 to 15, sometimes 20 meters. But these are enabling them to draw on huge stockpiles of very large demolition bombs from the Soviet era. So Fab 500, so 1,000 pound, 500 kilogram bomb. Fab 1,500, so 3,000 pound bomb. And they also have Fab 3000s, which are 3,000 kilograms, 6,000 pound bomb. These are many, many, many times more powerful than any artillery round, for example. And because they're available in such numbers, the Russians are dropping, still 400 to 500 a week, typically. And they can just concentrate these on the exact defense lines, the exact tree lines where the Ukrainian positions are, any particular strong points. And they just keep going, tens of them over many days. And explosive effect doesn't scale linearly. So the impact of one 500 kilogram projectile is typically much more dangerous than the impact of 10, 50 kilogram projectiles. Especially if you're dug in, because explosive force penetrating with blast effects through to buried positions, or going around corners in trench systems that have corners to limit blast, tends to have some thresholds. But essentially, they are able to be launched from beyond the range, or effective range, of Ukrainian ground-based air defenses. The fighters that have been supplied F-16 and Mirage 2000 don't have access to air-to-air missiles which have sufficient practical range to actually intercept these launches for various reasons. But when you see kind of Wikipedia type ranges of 180 kilometers, let's say, for an AMRAAM, that assumes that the target is coming directly towards you, is unaware, doesn't change its trajectory, doesn't defend itself, and also it assumes that you are launching that AMRAAM at, let's say, 55,000 feet above the speed of sound, which is not possible for Ukrainian pilots because of the Russian ground-based air defense cover and fighter cover. So it's pretty difficult to intercept these glide bomb launches. And just the repeatability means that they are one of the key problems for Ukraine trying to hold key points like Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, and it's something that in a direct conflict with Russian forces, NATO forces would have real problems with too, because it would significantly increase the pressure that we would face to deconstruct the Russian ground-based air defense network quickly, because our own forces in whatever area a clash was happening would be taking hundreds of glide bomb hits, and that would cause mass casualties, however well dug in we were. And there's no real way to intercept them.
No trench system could survive those.
I mean, a trench system is better than not having a trench system, but yeah, it's if the Russians are able to just cycle it,
it's irrelevant if you get those sorts of bombs coming in to a trench system. It's really irrelevant. And
yeah,
that's part of
and so we would need to get what are called offensive counter air sweeps in pretty deep inside Russian air defense coverage really quickly, which would further increase the pressure on us to, for example, take down the air defenses in Kaliningrad as fast as possible, which again brings us back to aircraft. We're broadly all right. Tactics and procedures, yep, we got it. Weapons, we don't.
But putting that into Ukrainian perspective, is the training of Ukrainian Air Force, because their pilots will have been trained in the old Soviet type tactics in the early days, and therefore providing them F-16s doesn't automatically give them the capability to go and deal with these air threats. Do you think that's part of the problem as to why we haven't seen the impact that the naive commentators in the West have said, give them F-16s, they'll be able to achieve everything? And what do you think of the announcement that Zelensky has just signed a big agreement to get the new Saab Gripen fighters? Do you think they will start to have an impact? Are you seeing the Ukrainians developing their tactics into more of the Western style?
So there's a significant difference between the Ukrainian pilots who have trained from scratch in the West, so in France and the UK, and then gone on to F-16 conversion. So new pilots who have only ever trained in the Western system, who are now coming on to F-16. They are typically, from what I understand, very good, very, very motivated, as you'd expect. But of course, they are junior pilots, and typically in a Western system, with all the advantages, you'd expect someone who joins a frontline squadron with full training to be combat ready in 6 months to a year as a wingman, so following somebody else and providing support. And then within maybe a year and a half to 3 years, be a two-ship lead, generally speaking, closer to a year and a half. And then being a four-ship lead between 3 and 5 years in. And a four-ship lead is kind of your tactical leaders. Most of our tactics for high threat revolve around units of 4 aircraft that you can then kind of mix and match, and there's a whole load of stuff you can do. And obviously with those sort of milestones come the ability to plan, brief, lead, all of that stuff that goes beyond the actual flying. So it's pretty difficult to see how the Ukrainians can generate, for example, the equivalent of experienced 4-ship leaders or weapons instructors, which is a kind of another rung up, think kind of PhD level fighter pilots, anytime soon. It just takes time. But of course, they have plenty of combat experience to draw on, so there are mitigating factors. The F-16 pilots who transferred from MiG-29, Sukhoi 24, Sukhoi 27 tend to have had more difficulty adapting to the Western way of kind of managing your sensors, your weapons, your tactics, just because what they have experience on is so very different. But you've seen them have considerable success against Garan 2 and 3s, cruise missiles. The issue with the Garans, so the one-way attack UAVs, is it's just not really sustainable to be using F-16 or Mirage to intercept them, because the missiles that they're using to intercept them are way too expensive for that, and also just fundamentally limited. There just aren't that many, and the production can't support it. So it's not just a question of money. There is a way to intercept UAVs like that with F-16. It's called APKWS-2, or the Americans would call it AGR-20, Air-to-Ground Rocket 20. It's a BAE Systems made thing. It basically converts an old rocket, so an unguided rocket from a pod, which is pretty cheap, to be laser guided, or there's versions with an infrared seeker. The US Navy, as US Air Force, has had a lot of success with those against Houthi drones in the Red Sea, so that's one option. Ukrainians do have it as a ground-based system already. But yeah, fundamentally, it's pretty tricky. In terms of any kind of ability to win air superiority, F-16 or Mirage were just never built for this kind of threat environment. They're designs from the 1970s and 80s. And what they're facing is, S-400s, S-300s, modern equivalents of the medium and short range SAMs as well, so SA-17, 27, 15, as well as Russian fighters in significant numbers, which are much more combat experienced than they used to be, and they're significantly better air-to-air than they used to be. They have much more powerful radars, long-range missiles that considerably outrange AMRAAM, at least in theory. And crucially, because of that Russian air defense coverage, those Russian combat air patrols can sit up at high altitude without being necessarily too worried about being shot at by long-range air defenses. And so they have a significant energy advantage. That the same missile fired from high up will go significantly faster than the same missile fired at low altitude because of gravity and air density. So there's a few reasons there. The Gripen E acquisition letter of intent that was signed in Sweden is good news for the Ukrainian Air Force in the medium to long term. But it's very much a medium to long term thing. The Gripen E is in early stage production at the moment for the Swedish Air Force, for the Brazilians, now for Colombia as well. And so it will take a while to build them. So I think that the Swedish Prime Minister was talking about, or Defense Minister was talking about 3 years maybe for early deliveries. So the Gripen E is not going to solve the immediate problems. There is a question mark around whether part of that deal will include supplies of the existing Gripen CD version, for which aircraft do exist in Sweden and elsewhere. And it's interesting, Zelensky mentioned deliveries in 2026 and that Ukrainian pilots have already been training on the Gripen. Well, 2026 and already trained pilots could only be the CD, so the kind of classic Gripen. That could significantly improve Ukraine's ability to go after the glide bombs if it was supplied with the European Meteor missile. So the F-16 and the Mirage are not compatible with Meteor. And Meteor is a European-made multinational missile. We use it on Typhoon in the UK, as well as it's going on F-35. But firstly, you would need agreement from all of the nations, so the UK, France, Italy, Sweden, Spain, and Germany, to transfer them. But what the Meteor does bring is, because it has a ramjet instead of alongside the traditional rocket motor, it carries significantly more energy into long-range engagements, if you can get it fast enough at the start. And so it would potentially provide a way to threaten those Russian glide bomb launches from a relatively practical standpoint.
So there's potential in the future, but it's a long way off, and the level of complexity is huge. I don't think we've properly understood this in our commentary, but Justin, I think you've explained it very, very clearly indeed. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.